how did a tragedy in Georgia become a catalyst of America's ongoing battles over immigration? Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, the podcast where we dive into the fine print of legislation and bring the big debates to your earbuds. I'm Sarah, and with me, as always, is my sharp and savvy co-host, Stephen. Stephen, are you ready to do today's deep dive?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And wow, we've got quite a lot to do and quite a lot to unpack. We're talking about the Laken Riley Act, an act that's actually probably quite familiar to a lot of people. It's one of those bits of legislation that's attracted a lot of attention, so people tend to know the name. Because, of course, it's a bill with a very big name and even bigger implications for immigration policy across the country.
Yeah, this one is heavy. It's named after a 22-year-old, Laken Riley, whose tragic murder on the University of Georgia campus in 2024 set off a legislative firestorm.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not just about responding to tragedy. It's actually reshaping immigration enforcement in the US in some quite profound ways. So the bill was signed into law by President Trump on January the 29th with bipartisan support. And it's worth sort of noting the fact that that bill was signed into law, because that's not something that happens very often with our Congress. Even when one party has control of Congress, obviously generally takes them quite a long time to actually pass and sign legislation. And so a bipartisan bill of this nature that passed through very, very quickly and was signed into law is something that's genuinely notable.
And this was the very first thing that the Trump administration did sign into law, which I think is
Absolutely.
pretty apparent that they have a huge focus on immigration. I feel like
Yeah.
February, the only thing that we've covered is immigration because there's just so much happening all around the US. And this tone was
Yes.
really set with this being signed into law just under a month ago. So.
Yes, absolutely. An early win for the Trump administration there. And obviously, they hoped that it would signal legislative wins going forward. I think they've been few and far between since, as you say. And I know they are struggling, certainly, with their sort of wider legislative agenda at the moment, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Before we actually get into Laken Riley, perhaps we should just talk a little bit about immigration. As we often try to do here, put maybe a little bit of an international spin on this. The sort of things we've discussed before, but immigration is an issue all over the world now. And in the past few years, it's sort of increasing in prominence all over the countries, particularly in Europe. Europe has a big problem with immigrants coming over from North Africa in particular, but through a variety of different routes, crossing the Mediterranean and sort of really pouring into countries like Italy and Greece. So some Greek islands now have far more immigrants on them than actually Greek citizens, which obviously has a huge impact on their tourist industry. A big debate within Europe as to what happens to all of those immigrants. How do you stop them getting in the first place? And when you do, where do they go? Obviously, more northern countries would say, why don't they stay in Italy and Greece? Whereas the Italians and the Greeks are less keen on that and say, no, every country needs to take its fair share. But that's impacted politics all over the continent, really. The latest example of this is in Germany. The elections, as we're recording this, just happened in Germany. And as expected, there was a massive surge for the AfD party, which is a far-right party. It's a party that only a few years ago was a bit of a joke, of one of those very fringe parties that you tend to get in European politics, which no one took particularly seriously. And then in the last set of elections, they got 10% of the vote. In this set of elections, they got 20% of the vote, which might not sound a lot by American standards. But you need to remember, obviously, in Germany, they have a proportional representation system, which means there's a lot of different parties competing for votes. So if one party gets 20%, that's actually a huge deal. There's a lot of parties that will get 3, 4, 5, 6%, and so on. So 20% is a lot. So while they didn't win, and while they're unlikely to form the sort of part of the coalition that will be formed by the centre-right party that actually won, it still shows that there's an enormous amount of support for far-right policies, and they ran very explicitly on immigration. It's the same as in France, where the far-right did very well. I've just got back from Denmark, and I was reading a little bit about Danish politics, and they're an interesting case because Denmark is an extremely liberal country, very, very liberal, the sort of thing that would have sort of MAGA people sort of apoplectic, really. So lots of social justice programs, very high taxes, very high sort of social safety net, and the like. And they're currently the current administration is a centre-left party. Now, centre-left parties tend to be doing quite badly across the board all over the world at the moment, but the current Danish administration is very, very popular, and they've done sort of a lot of things, a lot of quite left-wing things. But one of the reasons why they're doing better than other parties is that even though they're left-wing, they have a very hard line on immigration. So it's quite interesting that they've sort of
Adapted.
realized that,
Yeah.
yeah, and adapted and said, and this is actually part of sort of Danish culture, even though they are very liberal on certain matters. They don't really like people in Denmark who aren't Danish, and they've always wanted people, any immigrants coming in, to integrate. It's a very different approach than the sort of the one that we tend to have, where we say, okay, well, if you become in and become a citizen, it's fine if you speak your own language, eat your own food, wear the clothes that you want to wear, that kind of thing. Well, Denmark's never been like that. They've always really wanted people to integrate, and so to spread them out and not build up different sort of ethnic communities and things. And so they really, as the number of immigrants rose, there was a big backlash against them. And I think the proudest achievement the current prime minister is to say that last year there was only about 800 people were granted asylum in Denmark.
Wow. Okay.
Which is a really, really small number, even though Denmark's quite a small country.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's the thing, and obviously in the UK as well, we've got the Reform Party, which is a far right party, effectively not quite as bad as some of the European ones, but certainly a very, very right wing party, surging in the polls, and their big thing is immigration.
Yeah, it definitely seems like we're, as a whole world, getting to this kind of boiling point. And it's one of those things where situations all over the world have gotten bad enough that enough people are fleeing where they're living that it's becoming a huge issue.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to see kind of, the American situation going on right now with the Doge department and defunding all of these programs that are supposed to help stabilize all of these other countries. And I do think a lot of the time we kind of miss the forest through the trees of, if we invest in communities and make those safe and good for people to stay in, then we're kind of treating other ailments of the issue if we don't have the issue, like
Absolutely.
immigration and other things like that. And so it is pretty interesting to see. I don't know how immediately we'll feel kind of the impacts of Doge and this, America First policy.
It's partly due, obviously, to the rising instability around the world, and I mean, they're looking at it from a historical perspective. Immigration right now isn't that much compared to sort of previous epochs. If you look at, obviously, the immigration at the end of the Second World War, which is probably the greatest movement of people that's ever been seen in terms of people moving for all over the world and in different directions. And then prior to that, of course, you had the huge outflux of people leaving from Europe to go to America, which was, again, one of the biggest sort of movements of people that have ever been seen. And those numbers were vastly greater in sort of percentage terms than the sort of numbers of people that are moving these days. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult for countries to absorb huge numbers of newcomers, and it does cause all sorts of problems, and there needs to be a way to do it. And I mean, just to sort of finish this off, of course, one of the biggest drivers in the years to come of immigration will be climate change. Again, something that the Trump administration doesn't seem that keen to actually grapple with, but that's once sort of sub-Saharan Africa and various other parts of the world start becoming uninhabitable, those people are going to want to move. They're going to be coming here.
Well, and it's interesting because a lot of people just think that the climate refugees will be people who are underwater, and they're not realizing that that's not the only impact that climate change will have on places. The uninhabitable pieces are often due to heat and other things like that. Yeah. So it is crazy, but let's dig in. So, Stephen, what are the core fundamentals of this Laken Riley Act?
So let's sort of start with the basics, really. So the Act primarily requires the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, to detain individuals who enter the country illegally and are charged with theft-related offences. So the key word here is require. It's not optional. It's not giving them the powers to do so should they wish. It is requiring ICE to detain these people. And it also gives state attorneys general the power to sue federal officials if they believe immigration laws aren't being enforced properly. So again, if ICE don't do this, the state attorneys general can actually sue them, turn around and sue them, especially if they feel that their state is facing financial harm because of it.
That is quite radical. And critics are saying this legislation could have some really serious unintended consequences, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's very broad, very sweeping. And one of the big concerns is, of course, the potential for overreach. As with all of these things, the devil is in the detail. So when you say illegal alien or undocumented migrant or recently arrived person or whatever, what does that actually mean? Because it doesn't really just apply to undocumented immigrants. It could also impact legal residents by mistake, really, including obviously DACA recipients, those with temporary protected status, all of those kind of things. And this is where it could get really wild. Some legal experts, like Professor Ilya Somin, warned that even something as minor as a child swiping a candy bar could trigger indefinite detention. Now, you could speculate, of course, well, that's not going to happen. They're not actually going to be going around arresting children. But remember, the law does require them to do so. So if that's how ICE interprets the law, then that's what they'll have to do legally.
Wow, that is intense. If ICE is warning that they might need to release current detainees to make room for these up to 60,000 new ones, that's a really massive shift. Do we have the infrastructure for this?
Well, not really. So Senator Katie Britt, who was obviously championing this bill, when challenged on this, was promised to secure funding to handle the influx. But it's a big if, really. And it's not only about the actual money, which is a huge amount of money. It's about exactly what do you do with all of these people? Are we going to lock them up in prison? Are they going to federal prison, state prison? I mean, surely there wouldn't be the capacity there. So do you have to build other places for these people to go? So would it be like days in internment camp, or you could call it concentration camp? And obviously Trump recently has said that they are opening some kind of internment camp type situation in Guantanamo Bay. So are we going to be shipping them all across to Cuba? So there's a lot of unanswered questions here about exactly how this could work. And then, of course, the bigger questions, of course, is it the right thing to do to be locking up all these people?
Yeah, I mean, tricky is putting it mildly.
Yes.
But a really interesting part of this bill is that it does have bipartisan support. So what drew Democrats like Senators John Fetterman and Ruben Gallego back to this bill?
Well, I mean, I think as we mentioned before, when you've got a bill that's named after a student who was murdered, then it's very, very difficult to oppose that bill because it appears that you're somehow siding with the murderer, which isn't the case. But as a politician, obviously, yeah, you always have to consider the optics, don't you? But it's also that politicians are genuinely concerned about people's safety. It really was a visceral reminder of the potential dangers when immigration laws aren't fully enforced, and the danger of dangerous people in society. The emotional testimony from Riley's sister, Lauren Phillips, really struck a chord with people, I think. She said, I cannot walk around my own college campus because I'm terrified of people like Jose Ibarra, who, of course, was the perpetrator here. So it's a really powerful sentiment and swayed lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. But of course, you could be a little bit more cynical about this and say that they recognized following the election that strong immigration enforcement was a popular policy. It clearly came through in the and they just want to jump on that bandwagon, possibly. But perhaps that's a little bit unfair on the senators.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard not to empathize with that. And it is interesting because it's hard to tell if we're just having more coverage over these violent attacks or if there are more violent attacks. And I know that there's even a lot of reporting coming out of Europe of a lot more issues with Afghan refugees, Somali refugees starting to inflict harm against people that we used to not see that way. And so it kind of, again, comes back to how can we invest in people in a way that makes this not be the case? Because, some people, they're bad apples. Like, that happens no matter where you're from and no matter where you're living. And if you're undocumented, documented, all of those things. But also a lot of these problems, especially with what this bill does include into it as a crime that is under enforcement for this, is sometimes people commit these types of crimes out of necessity, not out of malice. And so it's a pretty interesting situation. But at the same time, there is a balance, a delicate balance between safety and our civil liberties here. So are there any kind of comparisons to other state level bills on immigration that we should be aware of?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, we've spoken about a lot of them over the past few weeks. We do seem to have a bit of a trend when it comes to talking about immigration recently. Maybe we'll need to look for some different topics in the future. But definitely, we're seeing a trend of aggressive immigration bills popping up. So Florida, which we've discussed, and I think we discussed last week, has introduced legislation with mandatory death penalties for undocumented immigrants who are convicted of capital offences, along with a raft of other really quite stringent penalties. And remember, of course, the Mississippi and Missouri, they proposed bounty hunter bills and life imprisonment for merely for being undocumented and actually being in those states.
Yeah, I mean, kind of every week that we're talking about it, the proposals kind of seem a little bit more wild and a little bit more far reaching and different states, different things. So there's a lot of different approaches in different places right now happening. And this Laken Riley Act feels a little bit more like a moderate bill in comparison. And, maybe that does bring us back to that Overton window shift that we've been talking about. Yeah. But it's still really pushing boundaries. And I'm really curious, Stephen, how does this fit into the broader national debate on immigration?
Well, we again, as we've discussed before in previous weeks, is part of this larger shift towards state-led immigration enforcement. The federal government traditionally handles immigration, but as states become more involved, we're seeing a patchwork of policies, some extremely harsh, and obviously some states who are acting to protect immigrants. Supporters of the Laken Riley Act argue that it fills these enforcement gaps, but critics really worry that it opens the door to widespread civil rights abuses and due process concerns, of course.
Yeah, that kind of seems like the classic tension between wanting to prevent tragedies and avoiding overcorrection. And with legislation like this, do you think that we're going to face a lot of legal challenges? How do you kind of think this is going to unfold?
Yeah, I would expect so, really. And probably less than 100%, which you would say for similar bills. Again, it's the whole Laken Riley tag. The fact that this is in response to such a tragedy means that people will be sort of less willing to leap up and actually challenge you. But you would expect to see some kind of legal challenges with a law like this that's really pushing the boundaries of federal and state powers. The broad scope of the act, particularly with the potential for pretty much indefinite detention for people who've been accused of minor crimes, makes it a prime target for civil rights groups. I mean, remember, what the law is actually saying is that ICE must detain anybody undocumented who is charged, not convicted, charged with a theft-related offence. So this is just stealing, this is shoplifting, this is, very, very minor crimes often. And they aren't the types of crimes that will usually result in indefinite detainment.
Yeah, and I mean, with ICE's warning about capacity issues, it feels like we could be headed for a logistical and legal nightmare. I remember back from Trump's first stint in office, we had a lot of coverage about the way that ICE was detaining people and the inhumane conditions. And, it seems like that's obviously going to repeat itself if there's this much of an influx of people. And, that should also probably bring along another legal nightmare in a little bit of a different way. But what do you think? I mean, does this act solve more problems than it creates? How is this going to look as it's being addressed?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So you're right. Last time, there was obviously this huge backlash against the sort of strict and stringent sort of enforcement of immigration law then. And what's planned this time round is a massive increase on top of that as well. So the interesting question will be, will people care as much? Because there has been a shift in public opinion sort of against immigration now. And what was unthinkable back in 2016 is now not only thinkable, it's actually happening as well. So if the goal is to enhance public safety, then it might work and people might actually like it. It might be sort of quite a popular policy. But it could if it does lead to these unintended consequences where very low-level offences trigger sort of serious detention, if legal residents get swept up in the chaos, this could actually flip public opinion, I think, very strongly against these kinds of laws. And then the bigger question, of course, will locking up thieves actually prevent more murders? Because remember, Laken Riley was murdered. This is about an immigrant who was a murderer. If you lock people up for stealing, will that actually help prevent such crimes in the future? I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with your 19th century French literature, but in Les Miserables, a very famous play, I've seen a book as well, and it was about somebody who's ended up spending 14 years in prison for stealing a piece of bread. So are we getting back to that? Is that really how we want to model law enforcement in the 21st century?
You mean the movie with Anne Hathaway? I think that's what you're talking about.
Movie, that's the one, yes.
I guess only time will tell, and it's clear that the Laken Riley Act is more than just a reaction to the tragedy. It's kind of a bellwether for where immigration policy might lead us in the next few years. At least.
Absolutely. And as we watch how this unfolds, obviously crucial to stay informed and engaged. So if you want to dig deeper, you can check out Issue Voters' full analysis. They do a really great job of breaking down both sides of the argument.
Great plug, Stephen. And that's a wrap for today's episode. If you enjoyed our discussion today, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, share your thoughts. What do you think? Is the Laken Riley Act a step too far? Does it strike the right balance? And where are we falling between safety and civil rights?
That's a very good question. Let us know your thoughts. And until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep looking beyond the bill number.